West Texas, August 1944. The Metzger Ranch spread across 20,000 acres of grassland where cattle grazed under endless sky and dust devils danced in afternoon heat. In the ranch kitchen, 12 German women prisoners rolled ground beef between their palms, shaping meatballs the way their mothers had taught them, singing quietly in their language while 3 cowboys sat at a long wooden table, hats in their laps, waiting. The women had offered to cook. The cowboys had accepted. No one had asked permission from Camp Hearn, 15 miles east. When Captain Morrison discovered what was happening, he faced a choice that would test regulations against humanity. It started with labor shortage. Summer 1944, and every able-bodied man under 40 was either overseas or in training camps, leaving Texas ranches desperate for workers. The War Manpower Commission authorized the use of prisoner-of-war labor for agricultural work, picking cotton, harvesting crops, tending livestock. Strictly regulated, carefully supervised, but necessary. Camp Hearn, outside Abilene, housed 400 German prisoners, mostly Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia, plus a small contingent of 19 women, Luftwaffe auxiliaries taken when communication stations fell across Italy. The male prisoners went out daily to surrounding farms and ranches, working under guard supervision for wages paid to the U.S. government. The women were different. Geneva Convention provisions about female prisoners were less clear. They couldn't be used for heavy agricultural labor. Kitchen work, laundry service, light domestic tasks, those were acceptable. But ranch work, uncertain territory. Robert Metzger didn't care much about regulations. He was 63, running a ranch his father had established in 1891, and he needed help. His son was in the Pacific with the Marines. His ranch hands had been drafted or moved to defense plants in California. He was down to 3 men, Charlie Dawson, 51, with a bad leg from a horse accident, Miguel Torres, 47, exempt from service because he supported 6 children, and Tommy Reed, 17, too young for draft but old enough to work cattle. When the War Manpower Commission representative visited in July, offering prisoner labor, Metzger had been skeptical. German soldiers working his land, sleeping in his bunkhouse. It felt wrong. But necessity has a way of overriding sentiment. "How many can you take?" the representative asked. "I need at least 8. 10 would be better. I can arrange 12, mix of men and women. The women can help with cooking, cleaning, domestic work. The men handle livestock and ranch maintenance." Metzger thought about his wife. Dead 3 years now, and the empty kitchen where he'd been making his own meals, badly. Thought about Tommy and Charlie and Miguel eating burnt beans and hard bread because none of them could cook worth a damn. "All right," he said, "send them." They arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August, transported in a covered truck with Sergeant William Hayes riding shotgun. 12 prisoners, 7 men, 5 women, blinking in the brutal sunlight as they stepped onto ranch property that looked nothing like the military installation they'd left. The Metzger ranch house was 2 stories of limestone and wood, built solid against Texas weather, surrounded by corrals and barns and outbuildings scattered across land so flat the horizon seemed to curve. Live oak trees provided shade near the house. A windmill creaked in the breeze, pumping water into a metal tank where cattle drank. Metzger met them in the yard, flanked by his 3 ranch hands. He looked the prisoners over with the same assessing eye he'd use on livestock. Not unkind, just practical, evaluating what he had to work with. "I'm Robert Metzger," he said in English, then nodded to Sergeant Hayes. "He'll translate." Hayes did so, his German adequate if heavily accented. "You'll work here 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. Sundays you rest. The men will handle cattle, fences, equipment. The women will handle house duties, cooking, cleaning, laundry, garden work. You'll be paid according to regulations. You'll be treated fairly. You cause trouble, you go back to camp. Understood?" The prisoners nodded, most of them looking more confused than anything. One of the women stepped forward, tall for a German woman, maybe 170 centimeters, with dark hair pulled back and brown eyes that held intelligence and caution in equal measure. "I am Helene Richter," she said in broken English. "I speak little English. I was teacher before war." Metzger studied her. "You'll be in charge of the other women. Make sure they understand the work and do it properly." Helene nodded, translated for the others in rapid German. Hayes showed them to their quarters. The men would stay in the bunkhouse, a long building with 12 beds, a stove, a table. The women got the old foreman's cottage, smaller but private, with its own kitchen and bathroom. Both buildings were simple but clean, better than military barracks. That first evening, the prisoners ate dinner in their separate quarters. Rations provided by the camp, basic but adequate. The ranch hands ate in the main house kitchen, where Metzger served them the same burnt beans and hard bread they'd been eating for months. "This is awful," Tommy complained. "Then learn to cook," Metzger replied. Charlie laughed. "Boss, none of us can cook. That's just a fact." Through the window, they could see lights in the foreman's cottage where the German women were eating their dinner. Metzger watched the golden glow, thinking about his wife's cooking. The roasts, the pies, the way she'd made that kitchen feel like the heart of the ranch. "Regulations say we can't ask prisoners to cook for us," Hayes said, reading Metzger's thoughts. "Geneva Convention. They can cook for themselves, but making them cook for captors crosses a line." "I know," Metzger said, but he kept looking at those lights. The routine established itself. Dawn came early. The men prisoners worked with Charlie and Miguel, mending fences, moving cattle, maintaining equipment. The women worked in and around the main house, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, tending a vegetable garden that had been neglected since Mrs. Metzger's death. Helene Richter proved to be an excellent organizer. She divided tasks among the 5 women with military efficiency. Greta Hoffman handled laundry. Anna Weber managed the garden. Liesel Koch cleaned the house. Erika Schneider and Helene herself took charge of the kitchen. Not cooking for the ranch hands, but maintaining the space, washing dishes from the men's terrible meals, keeping things organized. On the 3rd day, while cleaning the kitchen after breakfast, Helene watched Metzger try to make lunch. He burned the eggs. The bread was stale. The coffee was weak and bitter. She said something in German to Erika, who giggled. Metzger looked at them. "Something funny?" Helene hesitated, then in careful English. "You cook not good." Miguel, sitting at the table, laughed. "She's being diplomatic, boss. You cook terrible." Metzger grunted. "I'm aware." Helene moved closer to the stove, looked at the ruined eggs, shook her head. She said something else in German, longer, more complex. Erika translated haltingly. "She says, in Germany, we would not feed this to pigs?" "She's got a point," Tommy said. Helene made a gesture, rolling motion with her hands, then pointing at ingredients on the counter, then at herself and Erika. The meaning was clear. Let us cook. Metzger looked at Sergeant Hayes, who had come for morning inspection. "Can they do that?" "Regulations say prisoners can't be compelled to cook for captors," Hayes replied carefully. "But if they volunteer," he shrugged, "gray area." "I won't order them to do it," Metzger said. "I'm not suggesting you should," Hayes replied. Helene was watching this exchange with sharp attention, picking up meaning from tone even when she missed words. She spoke again in German, slower this time, giving Erica time to translate. She says she wants to cook. Says it is waste to have kitchen and not use proper. Says in Germany her mother's kitchen was proud place. Says she can make good food if you permit. Metzger looked at the burned eggs, the hard bread, the weak coffee. Looked at Helene's expression, not pleading, but offering something between dignity and practical solution. "You want to cook?" he asked. Helene nodded firmly. Yes, I want to cook." "You don't have to. I'm not ordering you." "I know. I want." Metzger glanced at Hayes, who shrugged again. "Your call, Mr. Metzger." "All right," Metzger said. "You can cook, but I'm paying you extra, separate from the regular prisoner wages. This is volunteer work. You can stop any time." Helene smiled. The first real smile any of them had seen from the prisoners. "I cook good," she promised. "You will see." That evening, Helene and Erica took over the kitchen with the focused intensity of generals planning a campaign. They inventoried supplies: flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, canned vegetables, a supply of beef in the cold room. Basic ingredients, nothing fancy, but workable. "We need onions," Helene said to Metzger. "And, how you say, spices?" He showed them the pantry, mostly bare except for salt, pepper, and some ancient paprika his wife had bought years ago. "This is not enough," Helene said, shaking her head. She wrote a list in German, handed it to him. "You can get?" He looked at the list, couldn't read most of it. "I don't read German." She took it back, drew pictures next to the words: onions, garlic, bay leaves, parsley, butter, eggs. "I'll see what I can do," Metzger said. The next day he drove into Abilene, bought everything on the list from the general store. The clerk gave him a curious look. "Getting fancy all of a sudden, Bob?" "Got some help with cooking," Metzger replied, offering no additional explanation. That evening, the smell coming from the ranch house kitchen was unlike anything the place had produced in 3 years. Onions frying, meat browning. Something rich and complex that made Tommy and Charlie and Miguel stand outside the kitchen door like dogs waiting for scraps. When dinner was ready, Helene invited them to the kitchen table. She and Erica served plates: beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread, coffee that actually tasted like coffee. The ranch hands ate in silence for several minutes. Finally, Charlie spoke. "Ma'am, this is the best meal I've had in about 3 years." Helene understood enough English to get the meaning. She smiled. "This is easy food. Tomorrow I make better." And she did. The next night was roast chicken with herbs. The night after, pork chops with apples. The night after that, beef roast with potatoes. Each meal was simple but perfectly executed, the kind of farm cooking that depended on technique rather than fancy ingredients. By the end of the week, the ranch hands were singing Helene's praises. Metzger found himself looking forward to meals in a way he hadn't since his wife died. Even the male prisoners, eating in the bunkhouse, benefited. Helene made enough for everyone, sending platters over with Erica after the ranch hands had been served. On Sunday, rest day, Helene approached Metzger with another proposal, translated carefully through Erica. She says she wants to make special meal, Sunday meal. She says in Germany, Sunday is for good food and family. She wants to cook traditional German food as thanks for letting her use kitchen. Metzger thought about it. The prisoners weren't family. This was a work arrangement, strictly regulated, temporary. But there was something in Helene's expression, pride mixed with homesickness, a desire to maintain tradition even in captivity. "What kind of food?" he asked. Helene's eyes lit up. She spoke quickly in German, gesturing, describing. Erica struggled to translate. Meatballs, German style, with, I don't know English word, with sauce, brown sauce, and potatoes, and vegetables, special meal. Sounds fine to me, Metzger said. Sunday afternoon, the kitchen became a center of intense activity. All 5 women gathered there. Helene directing, Erica assisting, the others preparing ingredients with practiced hands. They mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, eggs, finely chopped onions, salt, pepper. A hint of nutmeg Metzger had bought special from town. Each woman rolled meatballs between her palms, golf ball-sized, perfectly round, shaped with the muscle memory of 1,000 family dinners. While the meatballs browned in a large skillet, Helene prepared sauce. Beef stock, more onions, a splash of red wine vinegar Metzger had in the back of the pantry, flour to thicken it, seasonings she'd been hoarding from previous meals. The smell filled the house, drifted out the windows, carried across the yard to where the male prisoners were resting outside the bunkhouse. The ranch hands gathered in the kitchen without being called, drawn by the smell. They sat at the long wooden table, hats in their laps, watching the women work with something close to reverence. "Haven't smelled cooking like this since my mama passed," Charlie said quietly. The women began singing while they worked, German songs, soft and melodic. Nothing martial or political, just folk tunes about harvests and homes and better days. Their voices blended naturally, alto and soprano weaving through each other like threads in cloth. Miguel crossed himself. "This is what heaven smells like," he said. Tommy just sat there, 18 years old, missing his own mother who was 300 miles away in Houston, feeling something break open in his chest at the combination of smell and sound and the strange domesticity of enemy women cooking in a Texas kitchen. When the meal was ready, Helene served it with ceremony. Platters of meatballs in rich brown sauce, bowls of buttered potatoes, plates of steamed carrots and beans from the garden. Fresh bread she'd baked that morning. Coffee, even a simple cake she'd made as dessert. The ranch hands ate slowly, savoring each bite. The meatballs were perfect, tender, flavorful, the sauce rich and complex. This wasn't just food, this was memory, tradition, care made manifest in a meal. "Helene," Metzger said when he'd finished his second helping, "that was extraordinary. Thank you." She understood his tone, if not all his words. "You are welcome," she replied in careful English. Then added something in German that Erica translated. "She says, cooking is what makes us human, even in war, even as prisoners. When we cook, we remember we are people, not just soldiers or enemies." The table fell silent. Outside, dusk was settling across the ranch, the sky turning gold and purple, cicadas beginning their evening song. "Well," Charlie said finally, "I don't care what government says. Any woman who can cook like that is all right in my book." The women cleared the table, washed dishes, put everything away with efficient care. When they were done, they walked back to the foreman's cottage, speaking quietly in German, their voices fading into evening shadows. The ranch hands sat on the porch, full and content, watching stars emerge. "We're not supposed to fraternize," Miguel said. "That's what Sergeant Hayes told us." "Eating their cooking ain't fraternizing," Charlie replied. "It's just accepting hospitality." "You think the Army will see it that way?" Tommy asked. Metzger lit a cigarette, blew smoke into cooling air. "I don't know, but I know I'm not going to tell them to stop cooking. Not when it makes this place feel like a home again." August rolled into September. The prisoners settled deeper into ranch life. The work was hard but fair. The food was good. The treatment was decent. Slowly, incrementally, the distance between captors and captives began to narrow. The ranch hands learned bits of German. The prisoners learned more English. Communication improved from broken sentences to actual conversation. They talked about cattle, weather, gardening, the small practical matters of daily life. They didn't talk about the war. That topic was off limits by unspoken agreement. Too raw, too complicated, too likely to break the fragile peace they'd built. Helene's cooking became legendary. She experimented with available ingredients, adapting German recipes to Texas supplies. She made schnitzel from pork chops, pounded thin and breaded. She made spätzle from flour and eggs, serving it with brown butter and herbs. She made apple cake with fruit from trees behind the house. The other women contributed their own specialties. Greta made bread that rose light and golden. Anna pickled vegetables with vinegar and spices. Liesel made butter from cream Metzger bought in town, churning it by hand until it was sweet and yellow. The male prisoners, seeing how well the women were treated, worked harder. They mended fences with care. They handled cattle gently. They maintained equipment like it was their own. The ranch thrived under their labor in ways it hadn't in years. One evening in late September, while the women were preparing dinner, 3 cowboys from a neighboring ranch stopped by to talk business with Metzger. They smelled the food cooking, saw the German women working in the kitchen through the open windows. "You got prisoners cooking for you?" one asked, surprise in his voice. "They volunteered," Metzger replied carefully. "Geneva Convention allows it if they're not compelled." Still seems wrong. Feeding the enemy your food, treating them like guests. Metzger looked at the man, younger, maybe 30, with the hardness of someone who'd never questioned simple answers. "They're not guests, they're workers, and they're doing a job better than I could do it. That seem wrong to you?" "They're Germans," the man said, as if that explained everything. "They're people," Metzger replied, "making the best of a bad situation, same as all of us." The conversation ended awkwardly. The cowboys left. But Metzger knew word would spread. People would talk. Sooner or later, someone would report it to Camp Hearn. Sooner or later, Captain Morrison would have to respond. October 3rd, Captain Morrison arrived without warning, driving up in a jeep with Sergeant Hayes and 2 other soldiers. The prisoners were working, men out with the cattle, women in the kitchen preparing lunch. Morrison was 42, career military, a man who believed regulations existed for good reasons and should be followed strictly. He'd served in North Africa, seen what German forces had done, lost friends to their bullets. He had no particular sympathy for prisoners, though he treated them correctly according to convention requirements. "Mr. Metzger," he said, his tone formal, "I've received reports that you're having prisoners cook for you and your employees." "They volunteered," Metzger replied. "I'm paying them extra. It's all above board." "It's a gray area," Morrison said. "The spirit of the convention discourages personal service relationships between prisoners and captors. It creates complications." "What kind of complications?" Morrison gestured toward the kitchen where the smell of cooking drifted out. "Emotional attachments, blurred lines. These are enemy nationals, Mr. Metzger. They're not domestic servants. They're prisoners of war who will eventually return to Germany." "I'm aware of that," Metzger said. "But in the meantime, they're here, and they need work, and I need help. Seems like a practical arrangement to me." Morrison walked to the kitchen window, looked inside. The 5 women were working. Helene at the stove, the others preparing ingredients, moving with synchronized efficiency. They were singing again, something soft and melodic. "You've created a domesticity that's inappropriate given the circumstances," Morrison said. These women should be doing work that maintains proper prisoner-captor distance. Like what? Scrubbing latrines, breaking rocks? Like work that doesn't involve daily intimate contact with their captors, Morrison replied sharply. Meals create bonds, Mr. Metzger. Sharing food is how humans build relationships. You're building relationships with enemy nationals. They're just cooking, Metzger said. It's not a relationship, it's a service arrangement. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Over the past 2 months, something had shifted. The women weren't just employees. They were, he struggled for the word, presences. People whose personalities had become familiar. Helene's quiet competence, Erica's quick laughter, Anna's gentle way with the garden. They weren't friends. The war made friendship impossible. But they weren't strangers anymore either. Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're humanizing the enemy. That's dangerous. They are human, Metzger replied. Whether I acknowledge it or not doesn't change that fact. It changes how you treat them, how you think about them, and that creates problems when it's time for them to leave. Morrison paused. I could order them back to camp, put an end to this arrangement. You could, Metzger agreed. But then what? I go back to burned beans, and you go back to having prisoners sit idle in barracks? Who benefits? Morrison didn't answer immediately. He watched the women through the window, their movements practiced and sure, their voices rising and falling in songs about places they might never see again. Finally, I'm not going to shut this down today, but I want to be clear. This is temporary. When the war ends, these prisoners will be repatriated. They'll go back to Germany. Any attachments you or your men have formed need to be understood as temporary. Do you understand? I understand, Metzger said. Do you? Morrison looked at him directly. Because in my experience, when humans share meals and songs and daily life, they start forgetting they're supposed to be enemies. And that forgetting causes pain when reality reasserts itself. I'll keep that in mind, Metzger said. Morrison left, taking his soldiers with him. But the warning lingered like smoke in still air. That evening, after dinner, Metzger asked Helene to stay in the kitchen while the others returned to the cottage. She looked uncertain, but agreed, standing near the stove with her hands folded, waiting. Captain Morrison is concerned, Metzger said slowly, giving her time to process the English. He thinks we're becoming too friendly. Helene was quiet for a moment. Her English had improved dramatically, but she still struggled with complex ideas. We are prisoners, she said carefully. We understand this. We are not, forgetting. I know you're not forgetting. But Morrison worries that the arrangement creates problems, makes things harder when you have to leave. We will leave, Helene said simply. War will end. We will go home to Germany, this we know. She paused, seemed to gather words. But while we are here, while we cook, we are not just prisoners. We are people doing work we know. Work that has meaning, purpose. We feed you, you treat us fair, this is good arrangement. Morrison says sharing meals creates bonds. Yes, Helene agreed. This is true. In Germany, we say the table is where strangers become family. But we are not family, Mr. Metzger. We are workers and employer. The bonds are small bonds. Respect, not love. Metzger nodded slowly. Morrison also worries about my men. Young Tommy especially. He's just a kid, never been away from home before, having women around, cooking like his mother used to cook. He trailed off. Helene's expression softened. We are careful with Tommy. We are careful with all of you. We know we are German. You are American. The war is between us. But here, in this kitchen, the war is far away. Here, we are just people making food. This is all." "Is it all?" Metzger asked. "Or have we become something more complicated?" Helene considered the question seriously. "In Germany, I was teacher. I taught children about history, about poetry, about being good people. Then war came. I became soldier. Not fighter, but soldier. Part of machine. Now I am prisoner, but also cook. Every day I make food, and I remember I am person, not just prisoner. You give me this. Let me be human even in captivity. For this I am grateful." "You don't have to be grateful," Metzger said. "You're doing good work. You deserve fair treatment." "Fair treatment is not common in war," Helene replied quietly. "We hear stories from other prisoners. Stories about camps where there is no kindness, where prisoners are just things, to be used and forgotten. Here you treat us like people. This is gift." Metzger felt uncomfortable with the word gift. "I'm just following the convention." "No," Helene said firmly. "Convention says minimum. You give more than minimum. You let us cook our food. You let us sing our songs. You pay us extra. You speak to us with respect. This is more than rule require. This is choice you make." They stood in silence. Outside, the evening was cooling. Stars emerging in clear sky. "Morrison's right about one thing," Metzger said finally. "When the war ends, you'll go home. This arrangement will end. We need to remember that." "We remember," Helene assured him. "Every day we remember. But until that day comes, we will cook, we will work, we will be grateful for kindness, and we will try to deserve it." October brought cooler weather and the harvest season. The male prisoners worked long hours helping bring in crops from neighboring farms: cotton, sorghum, corn. The ranch thrived on their labor. Money came in, debts got paid. Metzger found himself wondering how he'd manage when the prisoners left. The women maintained the house and kitchen with unwavering dedication. They preserved vegetables from the garden, pickles, jams, canned tomatoes. They sewed and mended clothes. They kept everything organized and clean. The ranch had never run more smoothly. On Saturdays, the prisoners received their wages, paid to them in camp scrip that could be spent at the camp store for personal items. The women saved most of their extra pay, planning for eventual return home. But occasionally they splurged on small luxuries: soap that smelled like lavender, writing paper, photographs. Tommy became particularly close to Erica, who was only 5 years older than him. Not romantically, nothing inappropriate, but with the easy friendship of siblings. She taught him German phrases. He taught her Texas slang. They laughed together over misunderstandings, shared jokes that spanned language barriers. Charlie formed a similar bond with Anna, the gardener. He showed her American plants, explained cultivation techniques suited to Texas soil. She showed him German methods for composting, for companion planting, for coaxing maximum yield from difficult ground. Miguel and Greta talked about children. He had 6, she had 3 back in Germany, sharing the universal concerns of parents separated from their kids by circumstances beyond their control. Even stoic Metzger found himself looking forward to conversations with Helene. They talked about ranching, about the challenges of running operations with limited resources, about the practical wisdom required to survive difficult times. Their conversations were never personal, always professional, but there was an ease to them that transcended the prisoner-captor dynamic. Morrison's warnings echoed in the back of Metzger's mind. Bonds were forming. Small bonds, respectful bonds, but bonds nonetheless. And bonds meant pain when they broke. November brought an unexpected proposal. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the prisoners asked if they could prepare a special meal, combining American traditions with German touches. "We want to thank you," Helene explained to Metzger, "for treating us well, for letting us work with dignity. Thanksgiving is American holiday, yes. We are not American, but we are grateful." Metzger hesitated. Thanksgiving was a family holiday. These prisoners weren't family, but they were people who'd made his house feel like a home again, who'd taken care of things his wife used to handle, who'd brought life back to rooms that had been dead for 3 years. "All right," he said. "Plan something appropriate." The women threw themselves into preparations. They roasted turkey and made stuffing with herbs. They prepared sweet potatoes and green beans and cornbread. But they also added German touches: red cabbage cooked with apples, potato dumplings, a special cake Helene remembered from childhood. On Thanksgiving Day, the long kitchen table was set for 15. Metzger, his 3 ranch hands, the 5 women, the 7 male prisoners, and Sergeant Hayes, who'd been invited as official supervisor to ensure propriety. They sat together, Americans and Germans, captors and captives, and shared a meal that transcended the war for a few hours. The food was extraordinary. The conversation was careful but genuine. They talked about things that connected rather than divided: weather, crops, animals, the small practical matters that made up daily life. When the meal ended, Helene stood and spoke in German, which Erica translated sentence by sentence. "We thank you for this food. We thank you for this table. We thank you for treating us like people instead of just prisoners. In Germany, we were taught you were enemies. Here, we learned you are human beings with kindness in your hearts. Whatever happens in this war, we will remember this. We will tell our children and grandchildren that even in dark times, there are people who choose decency over cruelty. Thank you." The table fell silent. Finally, Metzger cleared his throat. "We're just following the rules, treating you the way the convention requires." "No," Helene said in English, not waiting for translation. "You give more than rules require. You give respect. You give dignity. This is choice, not rule. We know difference." Miguel crossed himself. Charlie wiped his eyes. Tommy looked down at his plate, struggling with emotions too complex for his 18 years. Hayes, who'd been watching with professional detachment, spoke up. "Just remember, this is temporary. When the war ends, boundaries reassert. Don't confuse temporary kindness with permanent relationship." "We don't confuse," Helene said firmly. "We understand situation, but we are also human. We feel gratitude even knowing it must end. This is not crime." "No," Hayes agreed quietly, "it's not a crime, just something that will hurt when it's over." December brought cold weather and news from Europe. Allied advances, German retreats, the sense that the war was entering its final phase. In the camp, prisoners listened to radio broadcasts with mixed emotions. They wanted the fighting to end. They dreaded what ending would mean. At the ranch, routines continued: work, meals, small celebrations. Christmas brought another special meal, another blurring of lines between prisoner and person, enemy and human being. January 1945 arrived cold and clear. The prisoners had been at the ranch for 5 months now. They knew every corner of the property. They knew the ranch hands' habits, Metzger's moods, the rhythms of the place. It felt less like captivity and more like exile, waiting in a strange land for permission to return home. One evening in late January, while preparing dinner, Helene asked Metzger a question that had been building for weeks. "When war ends, what happens to us?" "You'll be repatriated, sent home to Germany." "All of us? Even those whose homes are in Soviet zone?" Metzger didn't have an answer. The complexities of post-war occupation were beyond his understanding. "I assume they'll figure something out." "And this place?" Helene gestured at the kitchen, the house, the ranch beyond. What happens here? Goes back to how it was before, I guess. I'll hire ranch hands if I can find them. Make my own terrible meals, manage alone. Helene was quiet for a moment. I will miss this kitchen, will miss cooking for people who appreciate food. In Germany, there will be no food to cook, only hunger and rebuilding. I'll miss your cooking, Metzger admitted. Miss having people here. House has been alive these past months in ways it hasn't been since my wife died. We are not substitute for wife, Helene said gently but firmly. We are workers. This is important to remember. I know, Metzger said, but they both knew the line had blurred more than regulations allowed, more than was wise, more than either wanted to acknowledge. February brought the incident that would test everything. A reporter from the Abilene newspaper, doing a story on prisoner-of-war labor in Texas agriculture, visited the ranch unannounced. He arrived during dinner, when the kitchen was full of people and laughter and the smell of Helen's cooking. He took photographs. The table set with care, Americans and Germans eating together, women serving food with pride, men accepting it with gratitude. He interviewed Metzger, asking about the arrangement, about whether it was appropriate, about how it looked to have enemy prisoners cooking in American kitchens. They volunteered, Metzger explained. They're paid fairly, it's all legal. But is it wise? The reporter asked. Fraternizing with the enemy? Creating domestic situations that blur important lines? They're doing good work, Metzger replied. That's all I care about. The article ran 3 days later. Front page, photographs and everything. The headline read, German prisoners cook for Texas Cowboys, humanitarian gesture or dangerous fraternization. The article was balanced but raised questions. Were ranchers getting too comfortable with enemy nationals? Were prisoners being treated as domestic servants in violation of convention spirit? Were bonds forming that would make repatriation difficult? Captain Morrison read the article and drove to the ranch the next morning, his expression grim. Mr. Metzger, we have a problem. Morrison stood in the ranch yard with the newspaper in his hand, anger barely controlled. I warned you about this. I told you not to let it become personal. It's not personal, Metzger protested. They cook. I pay them, that's all. This photograph says different. Morrison thrust the paper forward. The image showed Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone at the table, laughing, comfortable with each other in ways that transcended professional distance. That was months ago. A holiday meal, nothing more. It looks like fraternization. It looks like you've forgotten these are enemy prisoners who will go home and tell stories about how Americans treated them like family. And those stories will spread. Other prisoners will want the same treatment. Other ranchers will think it's acceptable. The lines will blur everywhere. Would that be so bad? Metzger asked. If prisoners are treated humanely, if we show that America wins not just through force but through decency. Morrison's expression softened slightly. In principle, no. But in practice, it creates complications. Prisoners who are treated well become emotionally invested in their captors. Repatriation becomes traumatic. And your men, he gestured toward the house where Tommy and Charlie were eating lunch, they've formed attachments that will hurt when broken. People form attachments, Metzger said. That's human nature, which is exactly why regulations exist to prevent it, Morrison replied. Listen, Metzger. I understand what you're trying to do here. I even respect it. But my superiors have seen this article. They're concerned. They want the situation normalized. What does that mean? It means the prisoners can continue working here, but the domestic arrangement ends. No more cooking, no more shared meals, no more holiday celebrations. Professional distance must be maintained, That's ridiculous. The cooking arrangement works. Everyone benefits. I don't disagree, Morrison said. But orders are orders. The women can continue with cleaning, laundry, garden work. But personal service like cooking meals for you and your men, that stops now. Metzger felt anger rising. This is punishment for treating people decently. It's enforcement of regulations designed to prevent exactly what's happened here. Emotional entanglement between prisoners and captors. So, what do I tell them? Sorry, you cooked too well. Sorry, you made my house feel like a home. Get back to scrubbing floors. You tell them the arrangement has changed. They'll understand. They're soldiers. They know about following orders. Morrison left. Metzger stood in the yard, looking at the house where 5 German women had brought life back into dead spaces, and trying to figure out how to explain that kindness had limits imposed by regulations written by people who'd never shared a meal with the enemy. That evening, Metzger gathered the 5 women in the kitchen. They stood in a semicircle, faces uncertain, sensing bad news. The army has ordered a change, he said slowly, giving Helene time to translate for those with weaker English. You can continue working here, but the cooking arrangement has to end. You'll focus on other tasks, cleaning, laundry, gardening, but no more meal preparation for me and the men. Helene's face fell. We did something wrong? No. You did everything right. Too right, according to Captain Morrison. He says the arrangement has become too personal. Personal, Helene repeated. She spoke rapidly in German to the others. They responded with confusion, disappointment, anger. Finally, Helene turned back to Metzger. We understand orders. We are soldiers. But we do not understand why kindness is punished. It's not punishment, it's regulation. Regulation that says we must not be treated like people? Helene's voice carried bitterness rare for her. Regulation that says cooking is too human, too intimate? What is left? Scrubbing and cleaning like servants who must not be seen or heard. That's not what Morrison meant. Is it not? Helene's eyes flashed. We thought America was different. We thought here we could have dignity even as prisoners. But dignity has limits, yes? We can be useful but not human. We can work but not connect. We can exist but not live. Metzger had no response. She was right, and they both knew it. Erica spoke up, her English halting but passionate. In Germany, they tell us Americans are heartless, care only for money and machines. We come here and learn this is lie. You treat us good. You let us be people. We are grateful. But now we learn. She struggled for words. We learn gratitude has limit. Kindness has fence. We can come this close, but no closer. I'm sorry, Metzger said. I don't agree with the order, but I have to follow it. We understand, Helene said quietly. All the fight had drained from her voice. We are prisoners. We forget sometimes, but Army reminds us. We are enemies, not friends. Workers, not people. This is truth of war. The women left the kitchen in silence. Metzger sat alone at the long table where they'd served so many meals, where laughter and songs had filled the space, where for a few months he'd forgotten what loneliness felt like. February turned to March. The cooking stopped. The women focused on other tasks with mechanical efficiency. They cleaned, they did laundry, they tended the garden. But the warmth was gone. The songs had stopped. The easy conversations had ended. The ranch hands ate Metzger's terrible cooking again, saying nothing, understanding that complaining would only make things worse. Tommy stopped joking with Erica. Charlie stopped talking gardening with Anna. Miguel kept his distance from Greta. The male prisoners continued their work with the cattle and fences, but the enthusiasm had dimmed. They did what was required and nothing more. Sergeant Hayes noticed the change during his weekly inspections. "Everyone's following the rules now," he observed to Metzger. "Professional distance maintained, exactly what Morrison ordered." "Yes," Metzger agreed. "Place feels dead, though." "Yes." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I thought the cooking arrangement was fine. Unconventional, but fine. These are complicated times. Sometimes regulations can't anticipate every situation." "Tell that to Morrison." "I did. He's following orders from above. Someone in San Antonio saw that newspaper article and decided it looked bad. Now, everyone has to pay for one reporter's need for a story." That evening, while doing paperwork in his office, Metzger heard singing from the foreman's cottage where the women lived. Soft German songs drifting through the cold air. Songs about home and hope and endurance. They weren't singing for anyone but themselves now. Private songs for private grief. He realized that Morrison had been right about one thing. Bonds had formed, and breaking them hurt everyone involved. April brought news of Germany's collapse. The war was ending. Allied forces pushed into Berlin. The regime's leaders met their final days in bunkers. Surrender was imminent. At the ranch, the prisoners received the news with muted dread. The war ending meant going home. Going home meant facing destruction, hunger, occupation, uncertainty. The safety of captivity would end, replaced by the chaos of defeat. Helene approached Metzger one morning while he was checking supplies in the barn. "When will we leave?" she asked. "I don't know. Could be months. Transportation is complicated. Processing takes time. And after we leave, what happens to you? To ranch? To kitchen? I'll figure something out. Always have." Helene was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something. About cooking, about orders to stop." "You don't have to. Please, let me speak." She gathered her thoughts carefully. "When you let us cook, you gave us dignity. You let us be people, not just prisoners. When Army said stop, they took dignity away. Not because cooking was wrong, but because it made us too human. This is what we will remember about America. Not the kindness, but the limit on kindness. The fence that says you can be treated well, but only to here, no further." Metzger felt the accusation like a blade. "I didn't want to stop the arrangement." "I know, but you did stop. You followed orders even when orders were wrong. This is what we all do in war, yes? Follow orders, even when we know better. This is how terrible things happen, not from hate, but from obedience." "That's not fair," Metzger protested. "I was following regulations designed to prevent complications." "And did they prevent complications?" Helene asked. "Or did they only make everyone sad? We were happy cooking. You were happy eating. No one was hurt. But regulations said happiness had limit, so now we are all obedient and unhappy. Is this better?" She walked away before he could respond, leaving him alone with questions that had no good answers. May the 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news reached the ranch in the afternoon. Metzger called everyone together, prisoners and ranch hands both, and told them the war in Europe was over. The American men reacted with subdued relief. The fighting had stopped. Eventually they'd go home, or resume normal lives, or find whatever peace looked like after years of war. The German prisoners reacted with visible grief. Some cried. Others stood in stunned silence. A few walked away, needing privacy for emotions too complex to share. That evening, without discussing it, the ranch hands and prisoners gathered in the yard between the main house and the bunkhouse. No one spoke. They just stood together as the sun set, watching light fade from the sky, knowing everything was about to change. Finally, Tommy broke the silence. "What happens now?" "Repatriation," Hayes said. He'd come for the announcement and stayed. Probably take a few months to organize, but eventually everyone goes home. Germany won't be home anymore, Helene said quietly. It will be ruins and occupation and hunger. Here is more home than there will be. This isn't your home, Hayes reminded her gently. This is captivity. You were always going to leave. Yes, Helene agreed. But for a while we forgot. For a while, when we were cooking and singing and feeling useful, we forgot we were prisoners. This was gift. Even though it ended, it was gift while it lasted. July 1945, the orders came. All prisoners at Camp Hearn were to be processed for repatriation. Transportation to port facilities would begin in August. Everyone needed to prepare. The prisoners at the ranch packed their few possessions: photographs, letters, small items they'd accumulated during their time in Texas. The women had saved most of their extra wages, though they knew German currency would be worthless. They'd bought practical things: work clothes, sturdy shoes, soap, basic necessities for the hardship ahead. On their last day, Metzger gave each woman an envelope. Inside was a letter of reference, written in English and German, attesting to their good character and work ethic. Also included was their full accumulated wages, plus an additional bonus he'd saved from his own funds. "This is too much," Helene protested. "It's what you earned," Metzger replied. "You made this place livable again. You deserve to be paid fairly." Helene took the envelope, but set it down on the kitchen table. She looked around the room where she'd spent so many hours. The stove she'd learned to use perfectly, the counter where she'd shaped meatballs, the table where she'd served meals to people who'd started as enemies and become something else. Not friends, but not enemies either. Something war had no word for. "I want to cook one more meal," she said. "Not because you order, not because I am paid, because I want to, because this kitchen should remember what it was for. Please." Metzger looked at Sergeant Hayes, who'd come to oversee the transition. Hayes shrugged. "What's Morrison going to do, fire me? War's over." "All right," Metzger said. "One last meal." That evening, all 5 women worked in the kitchen one final time. They made the same meal they'd made that first Sunday months ago: meatballs and brown sauce, buttered potatoes, vegetables from the garden they'd tended. Simple food, perfectly executed, made with care. Everyone gathered at the long table: the 5 women, the 7 male prisoners, Metzger and his 3 ranch hands, Sergeant Hayes. 15 people who'd shared work and meals and small kindnesses across the great divide of war. Helene served the food with ceremony, as if this were a holiday instead of a goodbye. When everyone had full plates, she remained standing. "I want to say something," she began in English, then continued in German with Erica translating. "We came here as prisoners. We expected cruelty or indifference. We found kindness. We found respect. We found Americans who treated us like people instead of things. For this, we are grateful." She paused, gathering control. "Some people say this arrangement was wrong, that we became too familiar, that lines were crossed. But I disagree. I think we learned something important here. We learned that enemies are just people caught on different sides. We learned that war is made by governments, not by individuals. We learned that even in conflict, humanity can survive if we choose it." She looked directly at Metzger. "You let us cook." This seemed small thing, but it was everything. Cooking made us human again, made us remember who we were before. War made us soldiers, made us believe that after war, we could be people again. Tears ran down her face, but she kept speaking. "I know we will probably never see each other again. Germany is far away. We are enemy's country. But I will remember this place. Will remember this kitchen. We'll remember that in dark time there were people who chose kindness over hatred. We'll teach my children this story. We'll tell them America is more than propaganda said. It's a place where even enemies can share meals and find dignity." She sat down. No one spoke. They ate slowly, savoring food and moment both, knowing this was ending. After dinner, the women washed dishes one last time, put everything away with care, left the kitchen cleaner than they'd found it. Then they walked back to the foreman's cottage to sleep their final night on the ranch. Dawn came gray and cool. The transport truck arrived at 8. Sergeant Hayes supervised the loading of prisoners. First the 7 men, then the 5 women, each carrying a single bag with all their possessions. Helene was last to board. She paused at the truck's tailgate, looked back at the ranch house, the kitchen window where she'd spent so many hours, the land that had been prison and sanctuary both. Metzger approached, handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Something for the journey. She opened it. Inside was a leather-bound book, a cookbook with German recipes, bought from a store in Abilene. Probably expensive, definitely thoughtful. "So you don't forget," Metzger said. "So you can teach your children your mother's recipes. So something survives." Helene clutched the book, unable to speak. Finally she managed, "Thank you. For everything. For letting me be person instead of just prisoner. For showing me Americans are good people. For the kitchen. For the dignity. You earned it all," Metzger replied. His voice was rough. "Good luck in Germany. Rebuild well. We will try." She climbed into the truck, joined the others on wooden benches, looked out at the ranch one last time. The truck pulled away. Metzger stood in the yard with Tommy and Charlie and Miguel, watching until dust swallowed the vehicle, and it disappeared toward Camp Hearn, toward processing facilities, toward ships that would carry prisoners home to a country that no longer existed as they'd known it. "Kitchen's gonna be empty now," Tommy said. "Yes," Metzger agreed. "Food's gonna be terrible." "Yes." They walked back to the house, stood in the kitchen that smelled faintly of meatballs and memories. The table was empty. The stove was cold. The space felt vast and hollow. "Was Morrison right?" Charlie asked. "Did we get too close? Did it hurt more because we forgot they were enemies?" "They weren't enemies," Metzger said. "They were people doing their best in impossible circumstances, same as us. Morrison was worried about regulations, but regulations can't account for everything. Sometimes you have to choose between following rules and doing right. I chose doing right. I'd make the same choice again." "Even knowing it would end like this?" Miguel asked. "Even knowing everyone would feel the loss?" "Yes," Metzger said firmly. "Better to have treated them well and hurt at parting than to have treated them poorly and lived with that shame. Better to have given them dignity and kept our own than to have followed regulations that denied everyone's humanity." The prisoners were repatriated in September 1945. Helene and the other women returned to Germany, specifically to the British zone, where conditions were harsh but survivable. They found their families, or what remained of them. They rebuilt lives in ruins. Helene wrote to Metzger once in 1947. The letter was forwarded through the Red Cross, arrived 6 months after it was sent. She told him about Hamburg, the rubble, the hunger, the slow reconstruction. She told him about teaching again in a school that met in a damaged church because the school building had been destroyed. She told him about using the cookbook he'd given her, about teaching children to cook traditional foods even when ingredients were scarce. "What you gave us at the ranch," she wrote, "was not just food or work or even kindness. You gave us proof that humanity survives war, that even enemies can recognize each other's worth. That mercy is possible when easier choices would be cruelty. I teach my students this. I tell them about the Texas ranch where German prisoners cooked for American cowboys, and everyone remembered they were people first, enemies second. I tell them this is how we rebuild. Not just buildings, but trust. Not just cities, but humanity. Thank you for that lesson. I will carry it always. Metzger kept the letter in a drawer of his desk. Read it occasionally when the house felt too empty, or when he wondered if Morrison had been right about regulations and distance. He never remarried, never hired another cook. Learned to make decent meals eventually, though nothing like what Helene had created. The kitchen remained functional but empty of the life 5 German women had brought to it for a few brief months in 1944 and 1945. Tommy went to college on the GI Bill after serving in Japan. He studied history, became a teacher, told his students about the German prisoners who'd worked on his family's friend's ranch, about how sharing meals had humanized enemies, about how small acts of kindness could transcend the largest conflicts. Charlie stayed on the ranch until he was too old to work. Tended the garden Anna had taught him to manage properly, grew vegetables with techniques learned from a German prisoner who'd become a brief friend before regulations and war separated them. Miguel's children grew up hearing stories about the German women who'd cooked in Mr. Metzger's kitchen, who'd sung foreign songs while making meatballs, who'd proven that humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. In 2003, a historian, researching German POW experiences in Texas agriculture, tracked down records from Camp Hearn. Among the files she found references to the Metzger ranch arrangement and the controversy it had generated. She also found letters, dozens of them, preserved in military archives, between Captain Morrison and his superiors discussing appropriate boundaries between prisoners and civilian employers. The correspondence revealed that Morrison had personally believed the cooking arrangement was fine, but had been overruled by officers who worried about public perception. The newspaper article had triggered concerns about other ranchers following Metzger's example, leading to widespread fraternization that might complicate eventual repatriation. The historian interviewed descendants of both the ranch hands and the prisoners. She discovered that Helene Richter had become a prominent educator in post-war Germany, known for teaching reconciliation and international understanding. Her children confirmed that she'd spoken often about the Texas ranch where she'd found dignity as a prisoner. Tommy's daughter shared her father's writings, journals where he'd recorded memories of the German women, reflections on how sharing meals had changed his understanding of enemies and humanity. They were just people, he'd written in 1970, caught in circumstances they didn't create, doing their best to survive with dignity. We could have treated them as things. We chose to treat them as people. That choice mattered more than any battle. The historian published her findings in 2005. The article made modest waves in academic circles but attracted little general attention. The story of German women cooking for Texas cowboys seemed quaint, disconnected from the grand narratives of war and victory and defeat. But for the people who lived it, the prisoners who'd found dignity in captivity, the ranchers who'd chosen kindness over expedience, the military officers who'd struggled with the conflict between regulations and humanity, the story was everything. It was proof that even in war, choices existed, that treating people decently wasn't weakness but strength, that sharing meals could build bridges across the deepest divides. It was proof that regulations, no matter how well-intentioned, couldn't account for the complexity of human interaction, that sometimes doing right meant breaking rules designed by people who'd never faced the specific situations requiring judgment. Most importantly, it was proof that mercy and humanity and simple kindness could survive even the machinery of the industrial warfare, that enemies could recognize each other's worth, that food shared at a simple table could teach lessons about dignity that no propaganda or regulation could erase. In 2019, The Metzger ranch was sold to developers. The house was torn down. The land was divided into suburban plots. The kitchen, where 5 German women had cooked meatballs for American cowboys, was demolished, replaced by generic structures that knew nothing of the history they occupied. But before demolition, a preservationist photographed every room. When she reached the kitchen, she found something unexpected, carved into a wooden beam hidden behind cabinets that had been installed decades after the war. Someone had etched words in German. Hier kochten wir und waren Menschen. Here we cooked and were human. The words had been carved carefully, precisely, probably by Helene during one of the last days before departure. A message for the future. A claim of dignity. A reminder that this space had been more than a kitchen. It had been a place where enemies learned to be people, where regulations couldn't completely destroy humanity, where meatballs and songs and simple kindness had proven stronger than war. The beam was preserved. It sits now in a museum in Abilene, labeled with a plaque explaining its significance. Visitors often miss it. It's a small exhibit, overshadowed by displays about combat and strategy and grand historical movements. But occasionally, someone stops, reads the German words, learns the story of prisoners who cooked and captors who chose mercy, and for a moment they understand something about war that casualty figures and battle maps can never convey. They understand that humanity persists, that even in conflict people can choose dignity over dehumanization, that treating enemies well isn't weakness but strength, that sharing food transcends borders and politics and all the things that divide us. They understand that regulations have limits, that sometimes doing right means breaking rules, that the best moments of our history come not from perfect obedience but from people choosing mercy when they could choose cruelty. And they understand that a simple meal, meatballs and potatoes, served with care by German hands to American mouths, can teach more about peace than 1,000 treaties. This is the legacy, not victory or defeat, not grand strategies or dramatic battles, just people choosing, in small ways, to be decent, to share food, to recognize humanity. Just German women rolling meatballs in a Texas kitchen, singing songs about home, proving that even in war, we can choose to cook and be human. Especially then,